Those things killed my brothers! Then kill me too, but spare him!
Why should I?
Because he protected my child.
Out here on Outpost 44, the frost didn't merely bite. It chewed through steel and synthetic bone. Caleb was halfway through a mug of battery acid coffee when the perimeter alarm screamed. It wasn't an ice storm triggering the sensors. Bleeding out on his welcome mat were the very monsters who had killed his squad. The heater in the main control room had been making a sound like a dying lung for 3 weeks. A rhythmic, wheezing rattle that vibrated through the grated floorboards and up into the soles of his boots. He hit the side of the casing with a heavy Durasteel wrench. The rattling hitched, coughed out a puff of ozone-scented air, and settled into a low, sullen hum. He leaned against the console, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His fingers smelled like grease and stale sweat. Outside the reinforced permaglass window, the world was a featureless void of shrieking white. Glisa 8B was a dead rock, a frozen purgatory where the military dumped washed-up veterans who were too broken for active duty but too stubborn to take the meager civilian pension. His job was to sit in this rusted tin can, monitor atmospheric scrubbers that hadn't worked properly in a decade, and not blow his own brains out. Most days, it was a coin toss. He took a sip of his synth caf. It tasted like scorched copper and regret. His right leg from the knee down, a mass of cheap military-grade servos and carbon fiber ached. It always ached when the temperature dropped below -40, which was every single day on this godforsaken rock. Then, the console lit up. A harsh, strobing crimson that cut through the dim, fluorescent gloom of the station. Proximity alert, Sector 4, airlock exterior. He froze, the mug half raised to his mouth. Out here, a proximity alert meant one of two things. A localized glacial shift large enough to threaten the structural integrity of the outpost, or a scavenger ship had crash-landed. The outpost didn't get visitors. There was nothing to visit but ice, wind, and him. He set the mug down. The liquid sloshed over the rim, sizzling faintly against the warm control board. He unholstered the sidearm at his hip, checking the battery charge by muscle memory, before reaching under the desk for the heavy kinetic rifle. It was an M88, a relic from the Rim Wars, heavy enough to bludgeon a man to death if he ran out of slugs. He racked the charging handle. The metallic clack-clack sounded obscenely loud in the empty room. He limped down the narrow corridor toward the mudroom. The temperature dropped with every step, the station's pathetic heating grid losing the battle against the external walls. Frost bloomed in intricate, jagged, fractal patterns along the seams of the bulkheads. His breath began to plume in front of his face. "Computer, give me a visual on Sector 4 exterior," he rasped, his voice sounding like crushed gravel. He hadn't spoken aloud in 2 months. A small monitor beside the heavy, blast-proof airlock door flickered to life. Static washed over the screen like snow, then resolved into a grainy, night vision green feed. He stopped breathing. Through the distortion of the camera lens, he saw them. 4 shapes huddled against the corrugated metal of the outer door. They weren't human. They were Varkan. Humanity had called them hounds during the war. Or rippers. A species of hexapedal predators that had achieved spaceflight just in time to clash with the expanding colonies. They were built for violence. Massive, barrel-chested creatures with an outer layer of chitinous plating layered over thick, coarse fur. They had elongated snouts filled with serrated teeth and 2 pairs of front limbs that ended in scythe-like claws. 10 years ago, on the mud-choked fields of Proxima, one of those scythes had sheared through his squadmate Carter's torso like wet paper. Another had taken his leg. He had spent 4 years fighting them, smelling their musky, ammonia-laced blood, listening to their guttural, clicking war cries over the comms. The peace treaty had been signed 5 years ago, but his body hadn't gotten the memo. His heart hammered against his ribs, a sudden, violent drumbeat. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. His synthetic knee whirred as he braced himself, raising the rifle, putting the red dot of the sight squarely on the center of the reinforced glass viewport of the airlock door. He took a slow step forward, his boot scraping softly against the floor. He peered through the frost-rimmed glass. They weren't moving to attack. They weren't planting breaching charges. They were dying. He kept the rifle leveled, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard, and just stared. The wind outside was howling, a physical force that made the thick permaglass shudder in its frame. The temperature on the external sensor read -72 degrees Celsius. Nothing biological could survive out there for long, not even the Varkan, whose homeworld was supposedly a temperate jungle. The largest of the four was slumped against the door. He could see the details of its body through the glass. Its dark, armored plates were cracked, oozing a viscous, dark blue fluid that froze almost instantly into jagged icicles. Its coarse, grayish fur was completely matted with snow and ice. One of its secondary forelimbs hung at a sickening, unnatural angle, clearly snapped in half. Beside it, two smaller Varkan were curled into tight balls, using the massive bulk of the leader as a windbreak. They were shivering violently, a full-body tremor that shook the snow from their hides. And then, underneath the leader's chin, tucked against its chest, something shifted. A tiny head popped out. A pup. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. Its eyes. It let out a sound. The thick glass blocked the noise, but he could see the vibration in its throat, the way its jaws parted in a weak, desperate whine. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. "Let them freeze," a voice in his head whispered. It sounded exactly like Carter. "They tore us apart, Caleb. They gutted us in the trenches. Let the ice have them." It was the logical choice, the safe choice. He was alone, miles from any Allied support, heavily armed but physically compromised. Letting 4 apex predators into his sealed, pressurized home was suicide. It didn't matter that the war was over. Treaties were pieces of paper signed by politicians in warm rooms, light years away. Down in the dirt, blood was still blood. He stared at the leader. As if sensing his presence, the massive alien slowly turned its head. Its movements were sluggish, jerky, the cold shutting down its nervous system. It looked through the glass, straight at him. He expected to see the feral, burning rage he remembered from the battlefields, the predatory intensity that preceded a charge. Instead, he saw a void. Its dark eyes were dull, clouded with frost and pain. It looked at the barrel of his rifle, then up to his face. It didn't bare its teeth. It didn't raise its claws. Slowly, agonizingly, the leader lowered its heavy head, pressing its snout flat against the freezing metal of the threshold. It laid its ears flat against its skull. It was a gesture he had seen only once before, in a xenobiology briefing file. Total, unconditional submission. It was begging, not for itself, but for the pup tucked under its chin. "Damn it," he whispered, the words rasping in the quiet mudroom. "Damn you." His hands were shaking. He hated them for being here. He hated them for making him look at them. And most of all, he hated himself for what he was about to do. He didn't lower the rifle, but he reached out with his left hand and slammed his palm against the emergency manual override for the outer airlock door. The heavy machinery groaned in protest. Ice cracked and splintered as the massive steel door slowly slid open. The shriek of the wind instantly doubled in volume, and a wave of brutal, mind-numbing cold blasted into the small airlock chamber, followed by swirling eddies of snow. Through the open door, he watched them. The 2 smaller adults scrambled backward, their claws scrabbling uselessly against the ice, terrified of the sudden movement. But the leader didn't retreat. It forced itself upward, its 3 good front legs trembling violently under its weight. It picked up the pup by the scruff of its neck, its massive, razor-sharp jaws, incredibly gentle. It dragged itself over the threshold and into the cramped airlock. The others followed, slipping and sliding, driven by the instinctual need to follow their alpha and the desperate lure of the marginal heat bleeding from the inner door. Once all 4 were inside, he hit the button again. The outer door ground shut, severing the howl of the wind. They were separated now only by the inner glass door. The airlock began its cycling process, hissing as it equalized pressure and blasted the chamber with thermal vents to melt the exterior ice. He stood there, his rifle pressed into his shoulder, the stock digging into his collarbone. He watched the ice melt off their fur, turning into a puddle of grimy, freezing water on the metal floor. The smell hit the internal scrubbers, a thick, heavy stench of wet animal, dried blood, and that sharp, acidic tang of ammonia that he associated entirely with nightmares. The green light above the inner door flashed. Cycle complete. He took a deep breath, tasting the copper in his mouth. He kept the rifle leveled squarely at the leader's chest. "Open," he commanded the computer. The inner door slid back with a soft hiss. The smell washed over him in a physical wave. It was suffocating. He didn't step back. He stood his ground in the center of the corridor, blocking their path into the main station. The leader looked at him. It dropped the pup onto the grated floor. The pup let out a wet, coughing wheeze. The leader took one step forward into the mudroom. It was huge. Even half-starved and broken, its shoulder was level with his chest. Up close, he could see the patchwork of scars mapping its leathery hide, older wounds that predated the frostbite. His finger tightened on the trigger. 2 pounds of pressure. That's all it would take to put a tungsten slug through its cranium. "Give me a reason," he whispered. "Just twitch. Give me one excuse." The alien didn't twitch. It didn't lunge. Its front knees buckled. It collapsed onto the metal floor with a heavy, meaty thud. It didn't try to get back up. It just lay there, its sides heaving as it sucked in the warm, oxygen-rich air of the station. The 2 smaller ones crowded in behind it, whimpering, pressing their bodies against the walls, their eyes darting frantically between him and the weapon in his hands. They weren't soldiers. They were refugees, starving, freezing, broken refugees. He slowly lowered the barrel of the rifle, pointing it at the floor. The ache in his synthetic knee throbbed, a phantom pulse echoing the real pain in his chest. He turned around and limped toward the supply closet. The next few hours were a tense, silent negotiation of boundaries, dictated entirely by survival. He didn't let them pass the mudroom and the adjoining cargo bay. It was a wide, utilitarian space with a reinforced floor and a heavy blast door that he could lock from the main living quarters. It was warm enough, bathed in the harsh yellow light of overhead halogens. He sat on a stack of empty supply crates near the doorway, his rifle resting across his knees. He hadn't taken his eyes off them. The Varkan had dragged themselves into a corner, furthest from the light and furthest from him. They formed a tight, protective circle. The leader lay on her side. He had realized it was a female, based on the narrower crest on her skull compared to the males he'd fought. The 2 subordinates, a scrawny male and a smaller female, were frantically licking the melting ice and frozen blood from their alpha's fur. The pup was tucked tightly against the alpha's belly, seeking warmth. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the station and the wet, rasping sounds of the aliens breathing. He leaned his head back against the cold bulkhead. His nerves were frayed, humming like a high-tension wire. Every time one of the subordinates shifted its weight, his hand twitched toward the rifle. It was muscle memory. His brain knew they were helpless, but his nervous system was screaming that he was trapped in a room with 4 apex killers. He looked at the alpha's broken leg. It was a nasty compound fracture. A jagged piece of pale, porous bone had pierced through the thick hide. The dark blue blood had stopped flowing, clotting into a thick, tar-like substance, but the surrounding tissue was swollen and black with frostbite. If it got infected, she would die. And a dying, feverish animal was unpredictable. He grunted, standing up. The sound made all 3 conscious adult aliens snap their heads toward him, their ears pinned back. A low, vibrating growl rumbled in the throat of the younger male. It sounded like an engine idling. He stopped. He brought the rifle up an inch, just enough to show he had it. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low, flat, devoid of aggression. "Just hold your damn horses." He backed out of the cargo bay, keeping his eyes on them until the doors slid shut. He went to the medical bay. The supplies were meant for 1 human. He grabbed a portable bioscanner, a large canister of broad-spectrum antiseptic foam, and a roll of industrial splint wrap meant for repairing pressure suits. When he returned and the doors hissed open, The young male was on his feet, standing defensively over the alpha. He bared his teeth, rows of jagged, translucent incisors. He didn't raise the gun this time. He slung it over his shoulder. It was a stupid, reckless move. If the beta leaped, he wouldn't have time to draw. But if he approached them, weapon drawn, it would end in a bloodbath. He had to establish something resembling trust, or at least a mutual understanding of non-hostility. He walked slowly, holding the medical supplies in his left hand where they could see them. "I'm not going to hurt her," he said. They didn't understand English, obviously, but tone was universal among pack animals. "I'm going to fix the leg." The young male snapped his jaws, a sharp clack that made him flinch. He took a half step forward. Before he could react, the alpha lifted her heavy head. She didn't growl. She let out a short, sharp clicking noise from the back of her throat. The male stopped instantly. He looked back at her, let out a pathetic whine, and slowly backed away, pressing himself against the wall. The alpha looked at him. She laid her head back down and closed her eyes. He knelt beside her. The smell of ammonia was overpowering up close, burning the back of his nose. Her fur was coarse, like wire bristles, and slick with melted snow. He could feel the immense, coiled heat radiating from her body, a furnace working overtime to keep the pup alive. He unclipped the bioscanner and ran it over her leg. The small screen spit out a stream of red warnings. Tissue damage, severe thermal shock, bone fragmentation. He didn't need a medical degree to know it was bad. "This is going to suck," he muttered. He grabbed the canister of antiseptic foam. "Hold still." He sprayed a thick layer of the white foam directly into the open wound. The alpha flinched violently. A strangled, high-pitched scream tore from her throat. Her massive muscles spasmed, and one of her front scythe claws slammed into the floor inches from his knee, gouging a deep trench in the metal. He threw himself backward, landing hard on his ass, his hand instantly dropping to the sidearm at his hip. The two subordinates were going crazy, barking and throwing themselves against the wall. But the alpha barked another sharp order. They silenced. She lay panting, her dark eyes locked on his. The claw remained embedded in the floor. She hadn't swung at him. It was a pain reflex. She had purposely missed. His heart was doing backflips. He swallowed hard, forcing his hand away from the gun. "Okay," he breathed out. "Okay, my fault. I know it burns." He crawled back over. She watched him cautiously, but didn't move. He took the industrial splint wrap. It was a kinetic hardening resin. He had to manually set the bone before applying it. He looked at the alpha's face. "I'm going to have to pull it. If you bite my face off, I'm going to be very upset." He placed one hand firmly above the break, gripping the thick, leathery hide. He wrapped his other hand around the limb below the fracture. He took a breath, counted to 3 in his head, and pulled hard, twisting sharply to align the joint. The sound of the alien bone grinding against itself made his stomach heave. The alpha let out a long, rattling groan, her jaw clamping down on her own forearm until blue blood welled up under her teeth. But she didn't attack. Working quickly, he wrapped the resin tape around the leg, pulling it tight. As soon as it was exposed to the air, it began to harden, forming a rigid, gray cast around the shattered limb. He sat back on his heels, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. His hands were covered in blue blood and white foam. The alpha slowly released her bite on her arm. She let out a long breath, her eyes drooping. The crisis of acute pain was fading, replaced by the crushing exhaustion of starvation and exposure. He stood up and walked to the emergency rations locker. He pulled out 4 blocks of compressed protein paste. It was designed to keep a human alive in a vacuum. It tasted like cardboard and sawdust, but it had 10,000 calories a brick. He tossed the bricks onto the floor near them. They landed with heavy thuds. The young male sniffed one cautiously, then recoiled. He looked at Caleb. "Eat it," Caleb said, leaning against the wall, feeling entirely drained. "It's all I got. Beggars can't be choosers." The smaller female nudged a brick toward the alpha. The massive leader opened one eye, sniffed the brick, and then, slowly, opened her jaws and bit half of it off. She chewed mechanically, swallowing with difficulty. Seeing their leader eat, the other two fell upon the remaining bricks, tearing into the tough synthetic packaging with their teeth. They ate with frantic, desperate energy, practically swallowing the paste whole. He watched them. The glowing bioluminescent stripes along their ribs, a feature he knew they used for communication and intimidation, were dull, barely flickering beneath their dirty fur. They were severely malnourished. They had been out there in the wastes for weeks, maybe months. Where had their ship gone down? Why hadn't they been rescued? The Varkan were fiercely territorial and deeply pack-oriented. They didn't just abandon their own. As he watched the pup crawl over its mother's cast to lick a smudge of protein paste off the floor, a cold realization settled into the pit of his stomach, entirely separate from the chill of the station. They weren't a scout team. They weren't a lost military patrol. They were fleeing something, and whatever could make 4 hardened Varkan warriors run out onto the lethal ice plains of Gliese, 8B, and beg a human for mercy, was something he really didn't want, knocking on his airlock door next. 72 hours. That was how long it took for the absolute terror of cohabitation to decay into a dull, grinding anxiety. The cargo bay smelled permanently of wet dog, copper, and the sharp chemical tang of his antiseptic foam. He had rigged a thermal space heater in the corner, diverting power from the secondary communications array. The temperature in their makeshift pen hovered around 10 degrees Celsius. To him, it was a meat locker. To them, it was a tropical paradise. He sat on his crate, nursing a lukewarm mug of synthcaf. His prosthetic leg was locked straight out, the servos whining softly in protest of the cold. The pup was currently trying to eat a heavy Durasteel wrench. It was a futile effort. Its primary jaws weren't strong enough to dent the metal, and its secondary mandibles just scraped uselessly against the handle. It growled, a high-pitched warbling sound, and shook its head violently, dragging the heavy tool across the grated floor. He watched it. He couldn't help it. It was the size of a large dog, entirely devoid of the lethal grace its parents possessed. It tripped over its own front limbs constantly. Every time it fell, the alpha would lift her head, let out a low, rumbling huff, and go back to sleep. "They gutted us in the trenches, Caleb," Carter's voice echoed in the back of his skull. It was a persistent ghost. He took a sip of the bitter coffee. "I know," he muttered aloud. The young male, the beta, snapped his head toward Caleb at the sound of his voice. He was pacing the length of the blast door, a restless, caged energy radiating from his lean frame. He didn't trust the human. Every time Caleb brought them water or more protein paste, he placed himself between the man and the alpha, his hackles raised, a low hum vibrating in his chest. Caleb didn't blame him. If the situation were reversed, he would have ripped his throat out 3 days ago. The alpha, on the other hand, had surrendered to exhaustion. The resin cast on her leg was holding. The swelling had gone down, the black, necrotic edges of the frostbite peeling away to reveal raw, pink tissue healing at an accelerated, terrifying alien rate. She mostly slept, a massive, breathing mountain of dark fur and scarred chitin. Caleb set his mug down. The silence of the outpost was suddenly broken by a deep, subsonic vibration. It didn't register on the audio sensors right away. He felt it in his teeth, a low, rhythmic thrumming that rattled the coffee in his mug. The beta stopped pacing. He froze perfectly still, his ears swiveling independently, locking onto the reinforced ceiling. The alpha's eyes snapped open. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked up. The bioluminescent stripes along their ribs, dormant for 3 days, suddenly flared a brilliant, blinding violet. It was the color of sheer, unadulterated panic. The pup dropped the wrench. It scurried under the alpha's chin, whining pitifully. Then, the proximity alarm on Caleb's wrist pad started screaming. Not a localized glacial shift. Not a scavenger. The radar ping was coming from the upper stratosphere, descending at a suicidal velocity. He swore, pushing off the crate. His knee locked up, sending a jolt of synthetic pain up his thigh. But he ignored it, limping heavily toward the main control room. The beta let out a frantic bark, stepping toward the open door. But Caleb slammed his hand onto the panel. The heavy blast doors slid shut, sealing them in the cargo bay. He reached the console and brought up the atmospheric scanners. The telemetry data painted a bleak picture. The descending craft was small, maybe the size of a heavy dropship, but its energy signature was massive. It wasn't bleeding off speed. It was burning retrograde thrusters at the last possible second, a tactical hard-deck landing designed to minimize anti-aircraft exposure. It was a Varkan assault skiff. "Computer," he barked, his throat suddenly dry. "Power up, point defense turrets. Grid vectors 1 through 4. Point defense systems offline," the automated voice chimed, infuriatingly calm. "Mechanical failure detected in rotational servos. Manual override required." "Piece of junk," he spat, hitting the console. The skiff hit the ice shelf 2 clicks north of the outpost. The impact registered on the seismographs as a localized earthquake. A plume of pulverized ice and snow erupted into the howling storm outside, caught instantly on the exterior camera feeds. He stared at the monitor. The ramp of the skiff dropped. 3 figures emerged into the blizzard. They were Varkan, but they looked nothing like the starving, broken creatures shivering in his cargo bay. These were hunters. They wore thick, insulated combat harnesses, plating bolted directly into their chitin. Their bioluminescence glowed a steady, menacing crimson through the driving snow. They carried heavy plasma repeaters slung under their primary limbs, moving with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. They weren't affected by the cold. They were equipped for it. They began marching directly toward Outpost 44. The communications console lit up. An incoming unencrypted transmission. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the receive button. His chest felt tight. His pulse hammered against his eardrums. He was a washed-up engineer with a bad leg and a surplus rifle. He was not a one-man army. He could just open the airlock. He could point them to the cargo bay. He could survive. He pressed the button. Static hissed over the speakers, followed by a series of sharp, guttural clicks and pops. Then, a crude translation matrix kicked in, rendering the alien syntax into harsh, digitized English. "Human installation. You harbor meat that belongs to the pack. Traitors to the blood. Return them. You will not be harmed. Resist, and you will be rendered." The feed cut out. He looked back down the corridor toward the cargo bay. Behind those blast doors were the monsters that had killed his friends. They were the enemy, but the things marching across the ice, they were the ones who sent them. They were the machine. He reached under the console and grabbed the M88 kinetic rifle. It weighed 20 pounds, fully loaded. It felt heavier today. He racked the slide. The heavy tungsten slug slid into the chamber with a satisfying, brutal clack. "Computer," he said, his voice eerily steady. "Depressurize the mudroom. Keep the inner doors locked until I say otherwise." He limped down the hall, grabbing a bandolier of spare magazines from the locker. He wasn't doing this for Carter. He wasn't doing this for the treaty. He was doing it because he hated bullies, and because they had tracking mud all over his station. He positioned himself behind a heavy, steel support pillar at the far end of the corridor, giving him a straight line of sight into the mudroom. The inner airlock door was transparent permaglass, thick enough to stop a micrometeorite, but a concentrated plasma blast would melt it in seconds. Outside, the heavy, rhythmic thud of their footfalls vibrated through the hull. They were at the outer door. Sparks showered from the external lock. They weren't bypassing the keypad. They were cutting through the heavy durasteel with a thermal torch. The metal shrieked, glowing a blinding, cherry red. He rested the barrel of the M88 against the pillar, wrapping the sling tightly around his left forearm to stabilize the heavy weapon. His breathing slowed. The panic faded, replaced by the cold, mechanical calculus of violence he hadn't felt in a decade. Windage, 0. Range, 15 meters. Ammo, armor-piercing. The outer door blew inward with a deafening crash. A cloud of superheated steam and pulverized ice flooded the mudroom. Through the vapor, the crimson glow of their bioluminescence pulsed. "Computer," he yelled. "Open inner door." The glass doors slid apart. The sudden equalization of pressure sucked the steam out into the corridor. The lead hunter stepped over the threshold, its plasma repeater raising, searching for a target. He squeezed the trigger. The M88 kicked like a mule, the recoil slamming hard into his bruised shoulder. The sound in the enclosed space was catastrophic, a physical blow to the ears. The armor-piercing slug hit the lead hunter, dead in the center of its armored chest plate. The kinetic energy was so massive it lifted the 600-pound alien off its feet, throwing it backward into the snow. Blue blood and shattered chitin sprayed across the walls. One down. Before the echo died, the second and third hunters surged through the doorway, using the falling body of their squad mate as cover. Green plasma fire erupted from their weapons, scorching the air, smelling of burning ozone and melting steel. A bolt slammed into the pillar inches from his head, showering him with molten shrapnel. A piece of slag bit into his cheek. It stung like a hornet. He ducked out, fired blind, and ducked back. The heavy rifle roared twice. A high-pitched screech told him he'd hit something, but not fatally. Clack, clack. His rifle jammed. A casing had stovepiped in the ejection port. He swore, violently yanking the charging handle, tearing the mangled brass out with his bare fingers. The metal was blisteringly hot. He leaned back out just as the second hunter cleared the mudroom, charging down the corridor with terrifying, insectoid speed. Its scythe claws were raised, ready to decapitate him. He raised the rifle, but he didn't have time to aim. Suddenly, the reinforced blast door to the cargo bay blew open. The locking mechanism, damaged by the power diversion, had failed. A blur of gray fur and violet light slammed into the charging hunter. It was the Beta. He collided with the armored executioner with the force of a freight train. The two massive aliens hit the metal floor, a chaotic tangle of snapping jaws, slashing claws, and roaring fury. The hunter was heavily armored and armed. The Beta was starved and unarmored, but he fought with the frantic, suicidal desperation of an animal protecting its pack. His jaws locked onto the hunter's secondary limb, crushing through the chitin with a sickening crunch. The hunter roared in pain, bringing its plasma repeater up, pressing the barrel directly against the Beta's ribs. "No," Caleb yelled. He leveled the M88 and fired. The slug took the hunter through the side of its elongated skull, dropping it instantly. But a microsecond before the slug hit, the hunter's claw spasmed on the trigger. A point-blank blast of green plasma tore through the Beta's flank. The young male howled, a sound of absolute agony, and collapsed onto the grating, blue smoke rising from the scorched wound. The third hunter, still in the mudroom, saw the opening. It charged. Caleb fired his last round. It missed, sparking harmlessly off the wall. The bolt locked back, empty. The hunter closed the distance in a heartbeat. He dropped the rifle, reaching for the sidearm at his hip, knowing he was too slow. The alien reared up, its massive scythe claws descending toward his chest. A shadow eclipsed the harsh lights of the corridor. The Alpha hit the hunter from the side. She was moving on 3 legs, the bulky resin cast dragging heavily behind her, but she still possessed the sheer, overwhelming mass of a dominant predator. She pinned the hunter to the bulkhead, her jaws clamping entirely over its armored throat. The hunter thrashed wildly, its claws tearing deep gouges into her unarmored shoulders, but she didn't let go. She drove her immense weight forward, crushing the hunter against the steel wall until a wet, heavy snap echoed through the corridor. The hunter went limp. The Alpha held it there for another 10 seconds, her chest heaving, her violet stripes flashing erratically. Then, she let the corpse drop to the floor. Silence descended on the outpost, ringing loudly in his deafened ears. The smell of burned hair, spilled ammonia, and ozone was thick enough to choke on. He stayed pressed against the pillar, his hand hovering over his pistol. The Alpha turned slowly. She looked at the dead hunter, then at the Beta, who was whimpering on the floor, clutching his scorched side. The smaller female and the pup had crept out of the cargo bay, pressing themselves against the wounded male. The Alpha limped heavily toward him. She was bleeding from 6 deep lacerations on her shoulders and chest. She stopped 3 feet away. She was close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her massive frame. She didn't bow her head. She didn't press her snout to the floor. The submission was gone. Instead, she slowly raised her primary right arm. She extended her deadly scythe-like claw and rested the flat, blunt side of it gently against his synthetic knee. It was a terrifyingly delicate gesture from a creature that had just snapped a spine with her teeth. She looked up into his eyes. The feral void was gone, replaced by an exhaustion so profound, so deeply recognizable, that it stole his breath. It was the look of a soldier who had survived the ambush, but knew the war wasn't over. He didn't pull away. He slowly reached down and rested his grease-stained hand against the thick, coarse fur of her forearm. "I know," he whispered, the adrenaline crashing out of his system, leaving him hollow and shaking. "I know." They weren't human and alien. They weren't veteran and monster. They were just two broken things at the edge of the universe, drawing a line in the snow, deciding that neither of them was going to die today. He looked over at the beta, pulling his hand back. "Let's get him to the med bay. I'm going to need more foam." If this gritty tale of survival and unexpected alliances kept you on the edge of your seat, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button, share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans, and subscribe to the channel for more immersive, pulse-pounding audio dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have opened the airlock? Your support helps us bring more universes to life.